You're now watching a clip from the Inspired by show. You can watch the full episode on our YouTube channel or listen on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So make sure to head over there, leave us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and follow the show. What attracted you to get into TV, reporting, print media, broadcast media, right way back when?
Well, my interest was always in writing and journalism. So I worked on the newspaper in high school. I worked on the newspaper in college. It was just something that I always I loved, and I felt like I really understood the way journalism worked and also its potential impact. And I loved in college being on the school newspaper and feeling like we could have a voice in what happened at the university. So that was really gratifying. And then I sort of thought I would go on and have a career in public policy. I was thinking about going to law school. I was going to go get a master's in international relations. But I thought first I'll take a year and go work in a magazine in New York. At the time, a bunch of my friends were leaving. I went to Princeton, which is close to New York. We were leaving. A lot of people were moving to New York. And so I ended up applying to a bunch of magazines and newspapers. And the best job I got was at Fortune magazine. Elsewhere, I would have been writing captions, or I would have been doing fact checking. But at Fortune, it was a reporter job. And I thought, I'll try this out for a year and see how it goes. And I really fell in love with it. And what I really found was that the business journalism lens enabled me to tell stories about people, about social trends, about society and culture, but through this business lens, which is very serious. There's something about the business world where there are hard numbers, there's data that's attached to things. It's not just about feelings and publicity and pop culture. It's really about hard facts. And I think at a time when the journalism world can become very fluffy or about just celebrities or pop culture, there's something very grounding about that lens of business news. And so I really fell in love with it. And this idea of using business as a way to tell stories about the world and about change was really compelling to me. And so I fell in love with it at Fortune magazine. And there I kind of fell into the TV thing. I was first at the time, Fortune and CNN were owned by the same parent company, and they would frequently have on reporters to talk about stories they'd written. So one day I wrote a story about 20 people who'd lost over $1 billion in the stock market crash of 2001. And they invited me on to talk about it. And I thought it was so funny that as a 22-year-old at the time, I was being asked to talk on live television. I just thought it was funny. I didn't get nervous. And they thought, oh, you're comfortable, you're articulate, we should have you back on. And that became a regular segment. So I ended up having a regular segment three or so times a week on CNN and CNN Headline News. And that's what led me to CNBC.
Wow. And what's it been like working at CNBC for 17 years? You mentioned the industry's changed a lot. I mean, I'm sure the organization has changed a lot. How has it been for you?
Well, I've been based out in Los Angeles for the vast majority of that time. So I'm a little bit on an island out here. I spend a lot of the time on the phone with my colleagues back east. But I think that, CNBC is such a great institution. People tend to stay here for a very long time. So it's actually not unusual. Most of my colleagues have been at CNBC for roughly the same amount of time or longer. So there's actually a real longevity here. But I think in an institution that does have such consistency, there is this opportunity to come up with new franchises. And I actually think that being a journalist is in a way very entrepreneurial, sort of very inherently entrepreneurial. It's always about pitching stories, right? What story do you want to tell? How are you going to convince your editor that it's worth investing the resources to tell this story? Obviously at a different scale than pitching a company, but I think there is something similar to that. This idea that you're always needing to come up with new ideas to tell a different story that's being told on another network or in the papers. So I think it lends itself to an entrepreneurial bent.
Yeah, I totally agree. When I was reading your book and I was hearing the stories of the founders that you've connected with, and then also hearing your story of how you push through, some of the bias and some of the other stuff that you talk about in the book, it did seem quite entrepreneurial. And I always find, imagine you're fresh-faced, you've just joined CNBC or even Fortune magazine back then. It's always great to have a mentor or someone that can guide us through that. Who helped you on that journey to sort of help you pave the path?
Well, it's interesting because when I started off at Fortune magazine, I was assigned to work with this writer who's an editor at large. And his name was Andy Serwer. Then went on to become editor-in-chief of Fortune magazine. He was at Yahoo. Now he's at Barron's. And I felt like I was apprenticed to an ultimate sort of legend in journalism. And I got to really learn from him, and I got to ask him advice. And that was the benefit, is I worked really hard doing interviews for him and doing research for him. And I earned his respect. And as a result, he would give me advice, and he really would push me. And so he was a great asset to have. His ear was really helpful to me as I navigated Fortune magazine and even the transition to television. And I have to say, at CNBC, I just feel so lucky to have colleagues who I could call upon for help and advice. And especially being 3,000 miles away, whether it's my colleagues in San Francisco, I'm up and down to San Francisco very frequently. I work very closely with my colleagues up there, and also the bureau chief. And then my colleagues back east, I'm a big believer in brainstorming. I think for me, it's really important to say my ideas out loud, to share my ideas on whether it's in emails or in meetings, and to have that constant conversation, because it pushes me to think differently, which is also something that came up in the book. But so I spent a lot of time on the phone with my colleagues back east, and I have many of my colleagues I've worked with the whole time I've been at CNBC. I feel like they know me, they know my strengths, and they know my weaknesses. And that sort of real understanding of who I am and who they are can enable them to really push me to be better at what I do.